Another aspect of Mary Pinchot Meyer is covered heavily in the books that I read was how she wanted to learn how to give the president LSD so that it would open up his mind to peaceful possibilities. I don't know. It just is pretty far out, but this was the thinking in the 60s when LSD was all the rage. And Timothy Leary was one of the biggest proponents of using LSD. And he was actually a professor at Harvard University. And according to reports, Mary went up from Washington, D.C. to go to Harvard to talk to Timothy Leary about how to instruct people in high places to use LSD correctly. I don't know if she had ever used it herself, but she wanted to work with other people that had actually administered it and could be used to open up people's minds. So she went up to Harvard, and I'm not quite sure how the story goes, whether she'd let Timothy Leary know ahead of time or if she just sort of showed up at his office on the Harvard campus. But he described meeting her as that she was very all business. Like she was acting like a Washington, D.C. powerful elite person, wanted to get right down to brass tacks and how to do it and everything. And he gave her some general information and she left and was going to investigate it further. Then he got kicked out of Harvard. Harvard didn't want anything more to do with this. He was actually, and some of his associates were actually giving LSD to some of the students without their knowledge, just really atrocious. Anyway, so he had a following though, and he wound up going to this kind of hippie estate in Millbrook, New York, in Dutchess County, north of New York City, and he took up residence there starting in November of 1963, which is the year that JFK was assassinated. But the story goes that Mary actually showed up at this estate, which is sort of near where she went to school in Vassar in Poughkeepsie, so she knew the area. And again, I don't know whether she had let him know ahead of time that she was coming or she just showed up, but she wanted to get more information on how to lead an LSD session. So it was kind of strange that she would do this a couple of times, come up from Washington, D.C. to meet with Timothy Leary, the main proponent of LSD. So that's just kind of a weird story. And other backstories are that, I don't know whether she told her friends that she had done this, but supposedly she and JFK had tried smoking pot in the White House. Anyway, you always wonder whether, when all this was going on, whether the White House was bugged and people like the FBI and the CIA were listening in to everything. You just wonder. So people had to know that this was sort of going on. So this is kind of an unsettling backstory to Mary Pinchot Meyer. As I discussed earlier, JFK had a lot of health issues. He had the back that he caused him constant pain. He had the Addison's disease. He was taking different drugs administered by his official White House doctor, but he also had his own private doctor who was kind of called quote unquote Dr. Feelgood, who would inject him and Jackie with like a combination of things, including, they feel, amphetamines to really give him high energy when he was really starting to lag and everything. So anyway, this picture is of his last night alive when he spoke to a huge crowd in Houston before going up to Fort Worth and Dallas. And there's one story that there was a Secret Service person who was actually underneath one of the tables there, or he's close by. Anyway, he was able to see JFK standing behind the lectern as he spoke. And one thing that he noticed was that JFK's hands were shaking. And it could have been a result of all the different drugs he was taking, or it could have just been that he was in so much pain. He would typically take it easy during the day of a normal workday in the White House. He would take a noontime swim in the pool, which I showed earlier, just sort of, it was like almost like a bath that would help ease the pain of his back. And then he would take a nap during the middle of the day. Well, I'm sure he didn't have time to do all this when he was going from city to city in Texas. So by the end of the day, he might have been in a lot of pain. So that could have been why his hands were shaking. Or maybe it's just a combination of things that he was putting into his system. So, or maybe he was starting to have some sort of degenerative degenerative type disease that was coming to bear. Who knows? He looked so healthy on the outside, but really he was racked with a lot of pain and instability on the inside. So unfortunately, the next day after this picture, he was assassinated in Dallas. This is probably one of the most unfortunate crime scene pictures you could ever see. It was a picture of Mary Pinchot Meyer, investigators on the scene at the C&O towpath. And I looked up the crime statistics for Washington, D.C. I was just curious. I mean, I know it's a beautiful scenic towpath, but Washington, D.C. has a reputation for having a high crime rate, and this goes back decades and decades. And I just circled here the murder rate in 1963 and 64, and she was killed in October of 1964. And between 63 and 64, there was a 39% increase in murders. And the following year, there was a huge increase in rapes. So there is a background of violent crime in Washington, D.C. It's just unfortunate because it's a beautiful city, but it does have that reputation. This just takes us through the latest year that they have the data reported through 2019. And in the interceding decades between the 60s and 70s and the 2000s is when the crime really spiked. So it's come down, but it's still kind of chronically high. They found a guy in the towpath area. They were alerted to the crime. Some witnesses saw a black man standing over Mary's body on the towpath and ran back to where he worked and called the police. There were no cell phones back then. And so the police came immediately, swarmed the area from both ends, and sort of did a dragnet to converge on the murder site to see if they could capture anybody in the area. And they caught this guy who was wearing the same clothes as the witness saw a man wearing who was standing over Mary's body right after she'd been shot. She had called out, "Somebody help me, somebody help me." And they heard the screams, they heard the shots, and then the man, and I think there were two men, they looked over a wall of a bridge and they saw another black man standing over Mary's body. The witnesses, by the way, were black also. So they arrested him. They thought they had their man. He had some dubious reasons why he was there. He said he was fishing, but there was no fishing pole. And they discovered he had left it at home and he was wearing the same clothes. But it went to trial, and his lawyer, a black woman lawyer who had taken the case pro bono basis because she didn't feel like people should automatically assume that because he was in the area, that automatically made him the criminal. And the trial went before a predominantly black jury in Washington, D.C., and they came back quickly with a verdict of not guilty. And one of the points that she had made was that the witnesses thought that the man that they saw standing over Mary's body was taller than this guy. But the prosecution said, well, this guy was wearing thick-soled shoes that increased his height by 2 inches, and it was close and everything. But the lawyer, whose name was Dovey Roundtree, she felt like he just seemed too meek. He wouldn't be the type to commit such a violent act. And he later was arrested and put in prison for raping a 13-year-old girl, and he had other crimes afterwards, but not too much beforehand. There's this mugshot of him from shoplifting, and he was in jail briefly for that. So they never arrested anybody else. The crime was never solved. So he could have been the guy, but he might not have been the guy. So the different books weigh in whether he did it or didn't do it. And one book says, after looking at everything and looking at his extensive crime record after, that there was a good chance he's the one who did it, but it can't totally be proven. The C&O towpath is actually a very long towpath that went along a former canal when canals were the thing in the 1800s. And it goes all the way sort of parallel to the Potomac River, all the way to Cumberland, Maryland. And it goes by Harper's Ferry, West Virginia, along the West Virginia-Maryland border. And then it comes down and it ends in Washington, D.C. So it's 185 miles long, and there's another former either railway or towpath that goes between Pittsburgh and this towpath so that you can bike all the way from Pittsburgh down to Washington, D.C. on like a separate bikeway that's 335 miles long. Back in the 1963, President Kennedy, he read about when Teddy Roosevelt was president. Teddy Roosevelt felt like all of the officers in the military should be able to be physically fit and be able to do a 50-mile hike in 20 hours or less. And President Kennedy resurrected that idea and he issued that challenge. He was big on promoting physical fitness in the American population because even back in the early 60s, they were starting to notice that people were getting bigger and bigger. And so one of the thoughts was, this is before people started really focusing on the food we eat, but he was emphasizing that people have to exercise more. So he issued this challenge, which reportedly like thousands of people took him up on the challenge that they could do a 50-mile hike in 20 hours or less. And one of those naturally was Bobby Kennedy. And so he came to the C&O towpath further out of the city and he hiked from Great Falls to Harpers Ferry, West Virginia. This is Bobby afterwards getting his feet massaged by his wife Ethel, and he did it in 17 hours and 50 minutes, which is pretty good. He was well under the 20-hour mark. And he did this in February, so it was cooler. One thing I just noticed about this picture, though, is there's a couple of packs of cigarettes sitting on a coffee table there next to the chair. I'm like, who in Bobby Kennedy's household smoked? I've never heard that he smoked, and I don't know whether Ethel smoked, but somebody was smoking. But that's one thing that gets me is sometimes people do these really amazing physical endurance tests while being smokers. I've even met a woman once who ran the New York City Marathon, and she was a smoker, but she ran the whole marathon 26 miles. So it's just amazing that you would do both extremes to your body. So here's the Great Falls of the Potomac, very scenic. Also dangerous. I read incident reports with the National Park Service that manages the towpath area all the way, the whole length of it. And there's kayakers that have capsized in this area and drowned. So it's a beautiful area, but you got to be careful. And other people have thought they could hop along the rocks over the river, but then they would fall into the river and get swept downstream and they'd find them days later. Then this is the place where Bobby Kennedy walked to, Harpers Ferry, West Virginia. Very scenic, very beautiful. Here's a picture of JFK with three guys who also did the 50-mile hike, including Clint Hill. He's the Secret Service agent and wearing all black. And he was called in to join the other two hikers, one who was Stash Radziwill, who was JFK's brother-in-law, and his friend Chuck Spaulding got drafted into doing this 50-mile hike. They hiked along a highway that had been completed but hadn't been open yet between Miami and Palm Beach, Florida, also in February of 1963, and they just made it under 20 hours. It did it in 19 and a half hours. But Clint Hill tells a funny story of being drafted at the last minute, and he didn't have any hiking clothes, so he had to hike the whole thing in his dress shoes. So anyway, JF came at different points to meet the hikers and sort of joke with them and encourage them. And here you can see two of them laying on the ground. They're resting, but you lay down too long, you're not going to be able to get back up and keep walking. So Clint Hill was smart to stay on his feet. Where Mary Pinchot Meyer was walking was right down at the southern end in Washington, D.C., along the towpath. Here's a picture of what the towpath looks like in Washington, D.C. And she would take a 5-mile hike, and she would be 2.5 miles out and 2.5 miles back. And this was her routine. Maybe she was thinking she was doing this also in honor of JFK and the 50-mile hike, but 5-mile hike is still a good hike. This is the area where she was murdered, very scenic area, but also it's not super heavily trafficked, people walking along the towpath. So it's nice if you want some serenity in an urban environment, but you never know who might be hanging out in the woods, unfortunately. So when I was reviewing incident reports, I'll get to that in a minute, but there have been a couple of other cases. The incident reports for the National Park Service for the C&O Canal go back to the 1980s, and there's been 1 or 2 murders in this area and a rape. Was actually surprised that there weren't more incidents here. This just shows you it's just from the same point where she was murdered, looking back towards the Georgetown University campus. So you can see where there are a lot of people in the distance, but where you are right here is very unpopulated. So that's how something can happen like like this, and very few witnesses might see it, what happened. These are the incident reports. You can go into them for each of the national parks. I have for a lot of the parks out west because I was interested in what kind of accidents and incidents happen to people. The National Park Service does a very good job of chronicling, usually going back to the 1980s, all the different things that happen and the level of response. And it's often a very high level of highly trained responses to various incidents. But Chesapeake and Ohio, in the Washington, D.C. area, didn't have many incidents, surprisingly. Mostly they were further out west. Mary Pinchot Meyer's murder in the 1960s sort of reminded me of another incident where someone who was connected to the Washington, D.C. establishment, Chandra Levy, she was an intern for the Federal Bureau of Prisons, which their main office was right in the government area of Washington, D.C., near the White House. Anyway, she disappeared and her body was found in Rock Creek Park, which intersects with the C&O Canal. Another very beautiful scenic area. I've walked along it, but they've had a couple of cases where especially women have been attacked. And in her case, they had a guy who was already in prison for attacking other women in the area, and they eventually indicted him, and he was put to trial, and they found him guilty. He was from Ecuador, and then they wanted to do a retrial after he had been sentenced. He'd been in prison for a couple of years, and then his lawyers got the justice system to do a retrial, and rather than go through the whole trial again, they decided not to prosecute him, but they deported him back to Ecuador. So officially, they've never definitely found out, just like with Mary Pinchot Meyer, they've never definitely asserted who actually killed her, but her skeletal remains were found in Rock Creek Park back in the early 2000s. And in her case, it turned out she was having an affair with a congressman from California, and they determined that he wasn't involved, but his political career was over. He didn't win re-election because the public was skeptical of whether he really wasn't involved. So anyway, Mary Pinchot Meyer, Chandra Levy, hopefully there'll be nobody else in the future. But Washington, D.C. shows in the overall context of where she was murdered, which is the C&O Canal runs along the Potomac River, which comes down from the northwest and goes through Washington, D.C., between Washington, D.C. and Virginia. You can see it's not too far from the White House. It's close to the Georgetown area where she lived. She had walked about 1.25 miles, about half the way of where she was walking to, before she was going to turn around and come back. Here's a specific location. This shows where she lived and where she had her artist studio, which was behind Ben and Tony Bradley's house. It was in a garage, converted garage, and where Ben and Tony Bradley lived was a couple doors down from JFK and Jackie's house before they moved to the White House. So Mary actually left the studio and went on her hike. She didn't leave from her house. She left from the studio. And one friend of hers saw her as she was going on her walk while she was still in the Georgetown neighborhood. That was the last person who knew her to have seen her alive. She came down and walked underneath the Key Bridge from Georgetown and then walked along the towpath. And then a witness saw a black man walking well behind her, but maybe catching up to her. There was a man who worked at the Pentagon for the military or one of the intelligence branches, and he would go on a noontime run. This happened around noon, midday, and he saw her as he was running going the other way, and then he saw this black guy. But then it was questioned by the one book that who was he really? Did he really see, was he really who he said he was? And could he have been part of a team of people that were sort of like scouts? But he came to the authorities, so it's like kind of a little far-fetched that if, let's say, if the CIA was involved, they would have somebody actually come to the authorities and report this, that they saw this black guy or whatever. I don't know. It just was a little hard to follow and accept. And this is the book where I spent a lot of time checking out who this guy who worked for the Pentagon really was, and the fact that he changed his name and got a new social security number. and people really pursued who was this guy. And the guy was not a willing person to answer questions, but you'd have to read the whole book. It gets very long, the whole telling of who was this person who was their witness to what was going to happen on the towpath. So this book puts the crime scene right on the front cover. It's one of the most unfortunate book covers. The other big story involved with Mary and her death was the night of the day that she was killed. Some friends of hers who were in Japan heard about this murder. It's amazing that news traveled all the way across the world back in 1964 that quickly. But her friends from Georgetown who were in Japan, Anne and James Truitt, they heard about this, and they knew, because they were close to Mary, especially Anne Truitt, who was another artist, that Mary said, if anything ever happens to me, and by the way, the fact that she said, if anything ever happens to me, kind of makes you think, well, was she worried that something was going to happen to her? And Mary supposedly thought she had seen someone leaving her house at one point. This is after JFK was assassinated. And another time, a door to her basement was open, a door that she never opened, and it was strange. So she felt like somebody had been in her house anyway. So she was kind of worried that some people might be following her. There was some worry. So anyway, she told her friend that she had a diary. She said, if anything ever happens to me, find that diary. And according to the story, it was to give it to James Angleton and have him dispose of it. Now, James Angleton is a much discussed high-up person for the CIA, and he and his wife also lived in Georgetown, and they were friends too with Mary Pinchot Meyer, and James Angleton worked with Mary's ex-husband, Cord Meyer. And I indicate here there's another person from the CIA, Wistar Janney. It starts to make you think that people who work for the CIA have unusual first names. You have Wistar and Cord. But Wistar Janney was the father of Peter Janney, who wrote the book about how he felt like the CIA was involved. And he also, very unusually, he points a finger at his dad as being involved somehow in a CIA plot to execute Mary Pinchot Meyer. So anyway, it's unusual that her instructions were to give the diary to James Angleton from the CIA. And the concern was, what was in the diary? Well, they didn't know what was in the diary, but she felt like that diary should not exist, should not be going into public hands for wide dissemination. So the hunt was on. This is the night of or the next day to search for this diary. So you've got all the things that have just happened. She's just been murdered horrifically, but now people have to look for a diary. So supposedly Anne and James Truitt, they called both Mary's sister, Toni Bradley, and her husband, Ben Bradley, and also called James Angleton. That's one of the stories. Another story is that they just called Toni and Ben Bradley, and somehow James Angleton found out about it, and word traveled fast. So one other thing about James Angleton is he was so close to Cord Meyer that he was actually the godfather of all three of Cord and Mary Pinchot Meyer's sons. So he was close to the family on both sides. What did they do? So Ben and Toni Bradley went to Mary's house to look for the diary, and the story goes, very unusually, who did they find already in the house but James Angleton? He had somehow gotten into the house and was looking for it, and I don't know whether he felt ashamed or embarrassed and left immediately, or if they all then looked for the diary together. Not sure how that story actually went down, but they looked throughout the house and they couldn't find the diary. So then Ben and Toni Bradley decided to look in Mary's studio, and the picture on the right is of the backyard of Ben and Toni's house, and I don't know whether the stone structure in the background is their garage where Mary's studio was, but anyway, Mary's studio was in this close proximity, her studio in a converted garage. So they looked in there. That was the plan. They were going to go there. So when they went to go look in the studio, who did they find again but James Angleton trying to pick the lock to go into the studio? So why was James Angleton so intent on getting his hands on this diary? So they all three looked for the diary, and they found something that was akin to a diary. And then there's two schools of thought. Was there a diary that was an actual diary, or was there like a artist sketchbook that had some narrative notes in it to the effect of what someone might write in a diary? Anyway, they all read it, and Ben Bradley says in his book they determined this was not for public dissemination, the stuff in the diary. And it didn't name JFK by name, but the strong implication was that who she was talking about was JFK in her diary. So they determined this was not a matter for public record. And the story goes that it was given to James Angleton to take to the CIA and burn it in some official incinerator. And then it turned out years later that they found out that he had never burned it. He had just kept it. And so Tony Bradley was upset about that and insisted that he give it back to her, which he supposedly did. And then she burned it in her fireplace, which he should have done in the first place. But he could have made copies of it or whatever. Maybe he felt like he should show it to Cord Meyer. That would be understandable. Who knows why he held on to it or why it was so important. Anyway, it's a blurring of whether he was acting officially in the CIA capacity or as a close personal friend. It just is that gray area. And I'd argue for either one of those points. I mentioned James Truitt before. He was an assistant to Philip Graham, who was the publisher of the Washington Post. And another weird story was in 1963, while JFK was still alive, Philip Graham, who had bipolar disorder, they think, he was given to really wide mood swings. Anyway, he went out to a newspaper conference, publishers conference out in Arizona. And I don't know if he was one of the official speakers, but he just went up to the front, grabbed the microphone and started ranting and putting everybody else in the industry down and going on a real rant. And then he was saying that JFK was having this affair with Mary Pinchot Meyer. And he was doing all this while he was taking his clothes off. Anyway, he was having a total mental breakdown. So word got back to Washington, D.C., and JFK had a government plane sent out to Arizona to get Philip Graham, pick him up with men in white coats, and bring him back to the Washington, D.C. area, where he was then involuntarily committed to a sanitarium and watched and everything. Then he supposedly was getting better, and they gave him a pass to leave. And he had split up with his wife, Kay Graham, and wanted to marry a young Australian woman, and that ultimately imploded. But he, on his weekend pass, he went to Kay Graham's estate, and that's where he somehow got a gun and shot himself, killed himself. So that was a tragic end to that story. And then James Truitt, who was his assistant, he split up with his wife, and Truitt from Georgetown, he moved to Mexico, but he was putting out stories about the affair, like years were passing, and he was considering it was okay to be more open about what he knew and everything, and he was talking about Mary Pinchot Meyer more and more. And then he committed suicide in Mexico. All these people committing suicide. And then Ben Bradley, same age as James Truitt, he was the editor-in-chief. He lived a long life into his 90s. But one of the things with Ben Bradley was, even though he and his wife, who was Mary Pinchot Meyer's sister, they did not know that JFK was having an affair with Mary. They were totally blindsided by it, he said. And they were both not happy to hear about this because they felt like Mary had not been open with them, JFK hadn't been open with them, and everything. And in his book, biography of his life, which is a very good read, he does talk about when Mary was murdered and what happened during that time. It was actually kind of a short part of his book. And this was written well before he passed away, and he misremembered or whatever a key thing that he had to actually go and identify Mary's body, but he said that she'd been killed by a single gunshot, but she was actually killed very widely disseminated with 2 shots, one to the head and one to the back that went straight through the heart. So it's kind of unusual that he would have, or his editors wouldn't have caught that key fact in his book. I just put this page here just to show how other people that have been involved with the JFK assassination died kind of under mysterious circumstances. Marilyn Monroe died of a quote-unquote accidental suicide in 1962. Dorothy Kilgallen. It's unusual that both women here both died of accidental suicides. Dorothy Kilgallen, she had interviewed Jack Ruby, and she was telling people that she had this information that nobody else had. She was going to break wide open the JFK assassination case about who really was involved. But then she died of an accidental suicide, and all of her notes went missing. And a recent article from 2025 where people are still trying to get to the bottom of that 60 years later and wanted to reopen that case, but the Manhattan district attorney would not agree to reopening the case. But supposedly there's going to be a show on Netflix about the mystery surrounding her death. And then other people that were involved with the JFK investigation, Sam Giancana with the mafia, he was executed execution style before he was going to appear before a House and Senate committee that was delving into the assassination like 10, 15 years later. George de Mohrenschildt, who was going to appear before another committee, he committed suicide using a shotgun in 1977. And then Jack Ruby, there was a mystery how he was diagnosed with cancer in December of 1966 while he was in jail, and then he died a month later, so that people thought that that was very unusual. So all these mysteries surrounding the Kennedy assassination, it could all be just coincidence or maybe not. Who knows? Another person who was really delving into the Mary Pinchot Meyer story and was interviewing various people and was a serious author, had written a book about Ted Kennedy and Chappaquiddick and everything, but he was writing a book about the Mary Pinchot Meyer story, trying to get to the bottom of it. He died by suicide. So a lot of these people in the journalism and writing fields seem to have emotional instability and somehow are dying by suicide. I don't know what it says about that profession, but one of the things that is said about Mary Pinchot Meyer is that she knew too much, and that's why she was killed. There was that thought. And my questioning of that is, what could JFK maybe have said to her about anything that he might have known about or suspected that he wouldn't have told other people also? Did Mary Pinchot Meyer have any special knowledge that JFK would not have shared with his wife, Jackie, for instance? Aside from Jackie confiding any really critical information, could have talked to any one of his other mistresses. Marilyn Monroe was no longer alive. She passed away in 1962, but he didn't. They all wound up living full-length natural lives or are still living, so he didn't confide in them anything that he might have confided in Mary. His male friends, he had many close friends. These are just some of the main ones. There are many other people that JFK was very close to. So Ben Bradley, of course. George Smathers was a senator from Florida. Chuck Spaulding was a good friend of his. Lem Billings, who actually was such a close friend that he actually stayed in the White House on the top floor, almost had a room of his own in the White House. He was there so often. Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, who JFK held in very high regard and was also the Secretary of Defense under LBJ after JFK. And then William Atwood and Bill Walton, he confided in them a lot and talked to them a lot. And then, of course, Bobby Kennedy, who was probably closer to JFK than anybody else. And maybe he had doubts about his brother's assassination, and it was something he wanted to really get to the bottom of if he became president, which unfortunately he was assassinated in 1968. But JFK also could have confided to Teddy Kennedy, who lived a full, natural adult life. So what Mary Pinchot Meyer might have known that no one else knew at that's a question. The two theories about how or why she was killed, the main theory proposed in the exhaustive book by Peter Janney, that it was a CIA hit job for whatever reasons. One of the things he proposes in his book is that there was a popular TV show in the 1960s, Mission Impossible, and there were other shows like Man from U.N.C.L.E. and other spy-related shows. And the story goes, he ran into Peter Graves, who was the main actor, the head of the team of people, never specifically called the CIA, but they were some special group of people that were out to fix things and right wrongs and whatever. But Peter Graves supposedly said that the writers of the show, Mission Impossible, they got a lot of their ideas from consultants who were CIA or former CIA people who told them about how things went down and everything involved with potential assassinations or executions or whatever. And Peter Graves said the writers would have never been able to come up with stuff. They wouldn't have dreamt that the CIA could plan things out so meticulously and so intricately that they actually would happen in real life. So the Mission Impossible show was based a lot on information from people who had been with the CIA. So if you really wanted to delve deeply into how the CIA works, you might get a hold of old episodes of Mission Impossible and study those, and then circle back and see how the CIA could have maybe done things in the case of Mary Pinchot Meyer's murder. That's just a whole level of research that you'd have to do. Was it a conspiracy, or was it this lone murderer person who was on the meek side, did have a criminal record, but could he have done it? And the other question I had, because I put extra question marks here, is the murder was sort of done execution style. We don't know what preceded Mary calling out for help, but there was one belief that the murderer could have been attempting to rape her or whatever, and she resisted, fought back, and was killed. But the way she was killed, it was almost too cold-blooded. It wasn't just someone who was nervous and shot her. They got behind her. She was shot in the temple and then shot through the back, through the heart. So she wouldn't have even survived the first shot, but they made sure she was dead. And it just seemed almost like execution style. So that's a question I throw out there. There'll never be answered, I don't think, but there's three possibilities, I think. And who or why would a person do a murder execution style if it wasn't Ray Crump, if it wasn't the CIA? What was the reasoning behind it? I don't think we'll ever know. That's the end of a series of videos I'm doing on Mary Pinchot Meyer and JFK, and it's really unfortunate. They were both bright, obviously articulate, well-meaning people. They might not have been married to each other, which was a complication, and Mary might have wanted to take JFK in certain directions that maybe wouldn't have been the best way to go in terms of trying LSD or whatever, but they were well-intentioned and good people, attractive people, and it's just a shame. So that's all I can conclude with at the end of this set of videos. I hope you've learned something. Maybe you'll see something that I didn't see, trying to take apart all the pieces and put them back together again, but I'm still left with questions at the end, and I think anybody who really reads all the books that are well written and exhaustively written will probably have questions on both sides of the equation, or three sides of the triangle. So anyway, thank you for watching, and we'll see you in a future video that won't have to do with all this intrigue and unfortunate information about a crime way back in 1964. Thanks for watching. So this is Milford Cemetery, which is open dawn until dusk. And it's unusual, you don't see too many signs at the gateway to a cemetery that say no hunting. I guess because hunting is such a big thing in Pennsylvania, they have to have a sign like that. Alright, so we're going to go up to the Pinchot mausoleum, and there are gravestones around the mausoleum. Back up this way. Hey, their mausoleum is up here in the forest on the top of the hill. So you read different conflicting accounts. One is that Mary Pinchot Meyer is buried in the mausoleum. But there's also a headstone outside here. So here's Mary's headstone. So I just put roses at the headstones of the people I recognize the most. Antoinette Pinchot, Tony Pinchot Bradley, who passed away in 2011. She lived a full adult life. She was Mary Pinchot Meyer's sister. Ruth Pickering Pinchot was Mary's mother. Outlived her by 20 years. There's different Gifford Pinchots. It's tough to keep track of all of them. Gifford and Amos, this is her dad, I believe, Amos Pinchot. And then this was her son, who was unfortunately killed in a car accident in front of their home. They had a large piece of property, so it was a busy road that they lived on. Michael. So he was 9 years old. Tragic. So he was killed in 1956, a week before Christmas. And then Mary, his mother, October 14th, 1920, and she was killed 2 days before her 44th birthday. And I believe this is her cousin, Gifford Bryce Pinchot, who was a doctor. Now, whether they're all buried in the crypt is a question. Looks like there's 10 burial vaults in the mausoleum, the Pinchot Mausoleum, here at Milford Cemetery. Beautiful, hilly, rural cemetery, right near the banks of the Delaware River, right across from New Jersey.